guilt is that you've done something wrong.
Right.
Shame is about not feeling worthy. Ancient cultures work on a shame honor system, rather than a kind of a guilt innocence system. And this is the remarkable thing about the cross, isn't it? Because the cross deals with both guilt and shame. Because at the cross, Jesus deals with all of the consequences of all the mess that we've made in our life. But he also comes and he adopts us into his family. And so he says that I choose you to be my son, I choose you to be my daughter, and I choose you because you are worthy.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Season 5 of the All Nations Church podcast, A Life Less Ordinary. We are going through this series with various friends of All Nations Church and from All Nations Church, learning how we can be more effective in different aspects of the Christian life. Kier, it's good to be together again.
Always, James, always.
Doing good?
Yeah, doing well.
This season has not disappointed, has it?
It really has not, and it will continue not to.
I know, it's going from glory to glory and strength to strength.
Yeah,
Speaking
amen.
of which, we're very, very pleased to be joined today by a good friend of ours, Harry Pickett.
Nice to meet you.
Nice,
Harry. Nice to meet you. I know you guys already.
We've been together before.
Yeah, we have indeed.
Yeah.
Nice to be here. That's what
If it was the first time we met together, then this would be a really interesting kind of hour we're going to spend together.
It would be, absolutely.
But Harry, before we dive into the topic we're going to look at together, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am the husband of the wonderful Bonnie Pickett. We're from Southport, which is up in the north. It's about half an hour north of Liverpool, for those of you who know. I have 3 kids. They are currently 5, 4 and 3, but they're likely to have changed ages at whatever point you guys are listening to the
how
podcast.
age works, isn't it, I guess.
It does tend to go up all the time.
It does. It's strange
Much as
like that.
we'd like to stop it. But.
Yeah.
And so I've got 2 kids that have started school now, and I've got one that's in nursery.
Nice.
And I work full-time for the church. I'm one of the elders that are up there, come in the last kind of 6 months into that role there. And kind of my main role up there is I look after the students and young adults, students and 20s. Absolutely love that. Do a lot of time on campus, talking with people, discipling people, as well as kind of other areas in the church as well. But yeah.
And you also are doing a fantastic job of kind of coordinating that nationally for our family church as well, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So real joy, just pulling people in together for that and trying to do what God is calling us to do and to reach and mark that generation.
Yeah, it's an important kind of age and stage of life for everybody, and particularly I think now in our kind of culture, helping people who've just left school or are just kind of moving out of kind of university life into professional life, helping them make those really good, godly, kingdom-based decisions that will help them be fruitful for the rest of their lives. I
think so. And I think what's quite unique about Gen Z in particular is that it's the most unchurched generation that is there in kind of living at the moment. And so it's not just really important, but it's vital, I think, to see them established in the things and purposes of God. Is that there's a real need to get our hands on them and helping them and disciple them in the things of the kingdom and stuff. So yeah, it's a real privilege for me.
So let's bust a bit of jargon. So when you talk about Gen Z, what for someone who's listening who doesn't know what that is, so how old would someone who's Gen Z be? When would they have been born? You're kind of looking kind of late 90s through to what, 2010 roughly?
Yeah. So it depends who you're talking to, but there's kind of rough, and then there's a little bit of sort of grey zones as well. But Gen Z would be kind of 95 to 2010.
Okay.
And then millennials 1980 to 95, and then kind of back.
So we would all kind of be.
We'll be in the millennial thing.
We would, yeah.
So I'm just on the. So I was born in 93.
Yeah.
So there's.
So was I.
And so there's a really interesting book by a guy called Tim Elmore called The New Kind of Diversity, and he's really good at just kind of unpacking some of the different stereotypes and characteristics, or more characteristics and stereotypes of the different generations.
Okay.
And talking about when you hit those kind of in-between years, how you see quite a lot of crossover when it comes to the generations and stuff.
Fascinating.
Very, very much so, just looking at those hallmarks that you see across the different ages and stuff. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's dive into today's topic.
Yeah.
So, Kier, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. So, we've already used the word, actually, you've used the word that we're going to be talking about. You used this word culture.
I have, yeah.
So, Harry, we brought you on because we effectively want to ask you some questions about how to engage with culture as believers, what that looks like. So I wonder if perhaps you could kick us off with giving us a bit of an overview. What do we mean when we say culture? Because I think perhaps some people might be familiar. When we talk about, say, a younger generation, we often see them as being at the forefront of what we would be like culture.
Yeah.
Modern culture, they got their finger on the pulse. We're just getting older, maybe. Or some people might be in denial about that. But
you speak for yourself.
Well, you were born in 1993, so. But perhaps you could help us understand that, because that is an element of it. But obviously culture is a bit broader than that, actually. So could you give us a bit of a definition, particularly to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting when you look at culture today is kind of how fast-paced it is, I think. I think certainly in the Western world, there's the impact of globalization has meant that things are much more dynamic and fast changing. And I think that you see a lot more tensions coming across all of the different generations, because there's cultural change happening within different generations as well. So you've got the kind of macro level stuff where you have cultures with regard to ethnicity, and cultures with regard to religion, with regard to countries, where you see the impact of the kind of narratives, the institutions, the habits, the moral frameworks, all that kind of thing. But then there's far more than you see taking place in the ancient world. Like now you see even over the course of 15 years, and even in smaller chunks of time, how there's much more tension points. You've probably read in the news, heard in the news, where you've got the boomers complaining about Gen Z and not being able to work and pull in the hours and all of that kind of stuff, and kind of calling it the snowflake generation, which I try and rebuke at every single opportunity that I can. But you see far more of that. So I think what's quite interesting is this kind of dynamic flavour that you're getting. Yeah. Well, not a dynamic flavour, but just this fast-paced, everything's changing. I was talking with Jeff Grice, who's one of my fellow elders in Southport, and he was just saying how he's in his 70s and just feeling like he's a stranger in a strange land, and just feeling really kind of almost displaced by everything that's going on. I know with a lot of the conversations that I have with people, where certainly the older people around stuff on identity and sexuality, they just can't even conceive of what's going on. They can't empathise in a lot of respects with how people can think like that and how fast things have changed. So I think to give a definition, it's the narratives, it's the moral framework, it's the institutions that are at play there, and it's all of these coming in that help to form a people, and you've got the people that are helping to form that.
Interesting. Well. So it's almost, I think it's almost a sense of their ways of perhaps thinking, speaking, acting, and the framework, like you said, that governs those things around, say, maybe like a demographic or a country or a people group, that type of thing. It's almost those ways of those people living, I guess, and seeing the world then. Would that be fair to say?
I think so. And I think that the greatest change that we're seeing today is just the fluidity of that, because of globalization and because of the hyper-connectedness of the world as well. You see these kind of micro-cultures really emerging, where people can connect across the world in kind of exciting ways, but really different ways as well.
It sounds like what you're saying, Harry. A culture is always in some way, shape or form corporate.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're always, by the sounds of what you're saying, dealing with some kind of group of people, no matter how large or small, and no matter how fragmented. Like you said, the world is much faster, much smaller than it used to be because of technology. But people kind of effectively coming together through some kind of shared idea, belief, habit, practice, that kind of thing. Which helps us then think about the fact that the concept of culture is not new. There have been cultures all the way through history and time, haven't they? So there would be a certain culture to Tudor England, or medieval France, or even in the future there'll be cultures. So when we think of the early church, kind of emerging into the Roman world, influenced by Greek philosophy in the New Testament, how did the early church kind of engage with the culture or cultures that it was embedded in? Yeah,
I think it's a really interesting question to think on, because I think when you look at the scriptures, it's been engaged with culture right from the off.
Yes.
And I think if you jump straight back into Genesis, what's quite interesting about that is tradition says that Genesis was written by Moses. And if you look at the time of Moses, what's happening is a people are being taken out of Egypt and taken into a new land, and God is bringing them into a new season, making them really into His special, unique people, and bringing them into a new culture. And I read a book which I found really, really helpful called "In the Beginning We Misunderstood." Which was looking at a kind of a different take on Genesis, and looking at how it's engaging with the cultural time, where you've got a people being removed from one culture and into another. And what's kind of taking place there is they are, when Jesus is saying, you have heard it said, but I now say unto you. Looking at how there are these kind of types that you see within Egyptian mythology, and in their worldview, in their culture. And then what Genesis is doing is saying, you've heard this, but now I want to reveal the truth to you.
Right.
And so you have some really interesting aspects of so like in Egyptian mythology, you have kind of the creator God who's fighting to create the world. And you have this, every time the sun goes down, they're waging war against the powers of darkness to stop the world from falling back into chaos. And then in Genesis, there's no problem. God just speaks. There is chaos to begin with, but then He speaks order into it. And it brings a whole new dynamic and a way of thinking that is really hard for us to grasp and to understand, because we're so out of that context. But it speaks of what God actually looks like, as opposed to these kind of warring entities. You've got a God who's creator of all and in control of all. One of the other kind of really interesting aspects that you see within that as well is the view on humanity, because in the ancient world, the humans were the slaves of God. And you would have one person who was made in the image of God, and that person happened to be the emperor or the king or the pharaoh or somebody like that. And what you find in Genesis is they go, no, everyone is made in the image of God. And it's so radical. It's hard for us to really grasp, where we go and say that each and every single person has a unique worth because they are made in His image. And so you have this cultural engagement that's taking place right from the very beginning, where there's this contrast that is taking place. And so I think when you kind of look at that example and you look throughout the scriptures as well, you start to see how one of the primary forms of engagement is an upholding of the truth.
Okay.
And saying, this is the truth. And in doing that, it stands in contrast to the rest of the world. There was a church father called Irenaeus, and he was one of the first people to really start to battle with heresies. He was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So he actually had conversations with John.
Wow.
He knew and heard the stories and all of that kind of thing. And what he did was that he knew that in battling with these kind of legitimate ideas of the time in Greek philosophy, and how that kind of merged with something called Gnosticism, that in upholding the truth, it shone the brighter when it was framed by the untruth that was there at the time. And so that engagement was a standing firm in what the truth was, and upholding what that was, and doing so in a kind of a culturally appropriate context. So if you look at, I think one of the best examples is when Paul goes to Athens.
Okay.
So in Acts 17, Paul lands in Athens, and then you kind of read of his journey as he starts going through and climbing up through the Acropolis, and he, as he's going, I think he goes to the Agora first, and he starts preaching, and then he gets into a bit of trouble, and he goes to a place called the Areopagus. N.T. Wright talks about the Areopagus not just being it wasn't really a forum to debate ideas; it was a judgment place. And so he's then said to go up there, and he's being judged for what he's believing in, and they would do pass sentence and things like that. And I went to Athens in December last year. I studied classics at university, so I grew up with kind of ancient Roman culture and ancient Greek culture, and it's so hard to describe what it was like, because the Areopagus is like this little stony rock. There's nothing really significant about it. It's just like this kind of elevated just above the Agora, so you can see the marketplace, and there would have been all the hustle and bustle. But as you kind of look, the Agora's in front of you, and as you look behind and to your right, the Acropolis is there, and the Acropolis is like this big mountain, and for thousands of years it had been a holy place. And what had happened over all of this time is they'd started building these temples, and on there you have the kind of pinnacle pagan temple of the world, which is the Acropolis, which was dedicated to Athena, and it was the Parthenon, which is this kind of magnificent really structure that is so imposing and speaks of the glory and the richness of Athenian society. And what you have to understand as well is that Athens was like the hub of the ancient thought world. Think kind of Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and all of these places just rolled into this place. But it's not just a university centre, but it's a religious centre as well. And so it's kind of like on steroids. It's to conquer this place or to own this place was like, that was the crowning jewel that you could have. Yeah. And I remember just kind of being stood there, and I was thinking about Acts 17 and just being in awe of Paul standing for the truth in the face of such a colossal idea, such a colossal culture, and being like the only person there. And Athens ended up being one of the greatest strongholds and didn't actually become majorly Christian until the 6th century. And it was one of the last places in the Roman Empire to kind of concede over to that. But you have Paul, and he's there on the Areopagus. And one of the things that he does is on his journey up, he sees a shrine to the unknown God. Yeah. And what he does is he starts speaking to the truth that's in their culture. And he says that you guys have seen this God, you just don't know who he is. Yeah. And so what I want to do is I want to reveal who this God is. I want to show you the truth. And in doing that, some people mocked him, some people didn't believe him, but some people did. And so what you had in the face of this great learning and this great culture, a shining of what the actual truth was. Yeah. What was really interesting in that is that Paul uses Athenian culture. He taps into their religiosity. He taps into their thinking, and he quotes one of their philosophers as well, and says this is actually pointing to something greater. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so you have moments like that where that's happening. You have it in Ephesus in a much more violent manner, where Paul and Barnabas go, and in standing up for the truth, what takes place is there's a whole city that want to kill Paul and Barnabas. They want to stone him. And what's quite interesting there is the real radical idea and the confrontation of the worldview that's taking place, because you have it's quite hard for us to kind of wrap our head around because it's so alien to us. It's probably a more similar like in Hindu contexts, where you would have a god or a deity who would be giving protection to a particular city. And so Christians were actually known as atheists to begin with because they didn't believe in the God that's there. And because of the kind of collectivist society that you were in, where the whole kind of idea of radical individualism and all that stuff was quite alien to them.
Yeah.
The idea that you were completely independent and could live your own life and be authentically you. And I mean, we'll get onto that later, I imagine. Yeah. And so if you came and said that I don't believe in the God of this place, or you insult the God of this place, you're actually bringing the whole city into a position of danger, because you could ultimately remove the protection of the God of that city.
Right.
And so when Paul and Barnabas come in and say, idols are a bunch of nonsense, guys, and you shouldn't be praying and sacrificing to these things, and there is only one true God, that idea was not just impacting the kind of economics of the idol makers, because Ephesus was had the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the ancient wonders of the world. It's a real significant place in the ancient world.
Yeah.
And what they're actually doing is in their mind, they're putting the whole city into a position of danger.
Yeah.
And it's quite offensive what they're saying.
Yeah.
And what you see taking place is an extreme cancelling of them, in saying, how dare you say that? You can't say that, and we need to stop you from doing that, because there's ultimately this potential danger that we believe that you could step into.
So in the stories you told us so far, just to take a step back slightly, and as a classics scholar, you might be able to speak into this, you're kind of making it quite clear that the culture of the ancient world that the church was born into and then witnessed to was different from the culture of Christianity. And that sounds a very obvious point to make.
Yes. Very different, radically different, yeah.
Which, as we'll come on to in a bit, is actually slightly different from the situation we find ourselves in today. But so give us a couple of examples of the kind of the values of Roman and Greek culture that the early church were witnessing to. For example, did the Romans and Greeks, did they care for the weak? Did they value the poor? Kind of, how was Christianity in its original iteration, in its first century kind of birth? How was it countercultural?
Yeah, that one that you mentioned there, James, is a really classic one.
Okay, right. Okay,
where there's a valuing of power,
right,
very much so.
Yeah.
So you think of certainly the millennial generation growing up on 300, the film.
I'm a gladiator man myself.
Spartans, what is your profession? The film alludes to a really harsh process of basically eugenics. So I say modern, but Nazi Germany took influence from the way that the Spartans kind of built their society, where there would be an inspection of a child when the child was born, and if there were any defects, the child would be cast out and just left to...
Like just thrown away?
Just thrown away, yeah. And then there would be further tests, think like as a 10-year-old, and then in a teen, and if they failed the test, they wouldn't be allowed into the society. And you would, it was all about creating the strongest, most perfect society that you possibly could. If you look at some of the most influential philosophers, you have a guy called Plato, who stands as one of the great thinkers. At the time in Athens, you had Socrates, who was incredibly famous for the way that he kind of transformed how people learn through debate and dialogue and all that kind of stuff. And Plato was one of his students. And then Plato had another student called Aristotle, who people might have heard of. And they kind of launched into two different schools. Plato, his kind of great work was a book called The Republic, which basically is a slightly more sanitized version of Nietzschean existentialism, where you have Nietzsche's whole philosophy, which the Nazis took from, was there is no such thing as right and wrong. The might is right, and whoever is the strongest claims moral absolutism, so to speak. And what you see within Plato's theory of in the Republic, it's his kind of utopian vision of what society should look like. And it was the philosopher king. And it was all about the smartest person being the strongest. And what was kind of intrinsically, what would sit very uncomfortably with people is the way that worth is attributed to people. In the kind of caste system based on how intelligent they were and how gifted they were. So you have the philosopher king who can have as many kind of wives as possible because it's believed that from him and from his seed you'll have the greatest chance of producing the next strong, smart person, for instance. And anyone who doesn't necessarily fit into the criteria would be cast out of that society.
So when Jesus comes along and does things like, blessed are the meek for they'll inherit the earth, or saying if you want to enter my kingdom, you have to be like a little child, or I'm among you as one who serves.
It stands completely in contrast to the values of the ancient Roman world. That the fact that that the God of that Jesus found glory in the crucifixion was something that was also deeply offensive to the Roman Empire, because the crucifixion was the worst kind of death that people could suffer, and it was exclusively done to slaves. So there was a famous execution that took place with in 70 BC, I think, of the slaves' revolt, and they basically lined the Appian Way, which was the main road coming out of Rome, with slaves. Kind of every mile or so that were crucified, because it was deemed as the not just the most painful, but the punishment that gives the least amount of dignity to someone. And for Christians to come and say that our God died a death like that and found victory in a death like that was deeply offensive to their concept of power, to their because you have to remember as well that ancient cultures work on a shame-honor system rather than a kind of a guilt, innocence system.
So what does shame-honor mean?
So shame is, guilt is that you've done something wrong. Shame is about not feeling worthy. So, and this is the remarkable thing about the cross, isn't it? Because the cross deals with both guilt and shame. Because at the cross, Jesus deals with all of the consequences of all the mess that we've made in our life. But he also comes and he adopts us into his family. And so he says that I choose you to be my son, I choose you to be my daughter, and I choose you because you are worthy. And this kind of taps back into the whole image of God stuff that you see at the very beginning.
So all that you're saying, then, it seems that I suppose it's really important for him to establish then that Christianity to the Roman world, to the early ancient world, it wasn't kind of like just kind of an improvement on the kind of lives that people were living. It was radically, demonstrably, powerfully different.
And offensively so.
Offensively so. So when people are talking about sharing their possessions, that's and touch a little bit on the kind of the sexual ethic. Was that different or?
That was radically different.
So
the whole idea of the ancient Roman world was a deeply patriarchal world, and patriarchal in all of its negative senses, where men had all of the power. You have some stories of some women who were able to be influential and all that kind of stuff, but that was not illustrative of the wider society. And so when it comes to the sexual ethic, especially when it comes to slaves and prostitutes, they were deposits for men just to use however you wanted to use. If you had a slave, you had no right to say no to your master in any way, shape or form. And so whether you were, whether it was in a heterosexual or a homosexual way, that was just the way that you had to do it. That was the culture at the time.
So Jesus and Paul celebrating and modelling not only abstinence, but what's the word I'm looking for? Celibacy.
Yeah, radical, completely radical as well, because you're in the ancient world. there were two ways to achieve immortality. If you read kind of the Odyssey and the Iliad, it's all about achieving kleos, this fame, this great deeds kind of thing. And so the greater the person you were, the more that you would speak throughout kind of history and eternity.
Right.
The other way that you do that is through having children. And so for you to have any kind of legacy in the world, you either need to be somebody that was so great that books are written about you, or you need to make sure that you have children. And so the family unit was prime.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So especially for noble women, it was deemed a really great offence to commit adultery with somebody, because the legitimacy of the children was really, really important. Right. So that's why you find in the ancient world a lot of the kind of, what's the word that I'm looking for? The administrative staff of emperors and...
Yeah, they'd be eunuchs, wouldn't they?
They were eunuchs, to prevent that from happening.
Well, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were most likely eunuchs, weren't they?
Yeah.
So when Jesus and Paul are also then kind of promoting a very loving, faithful, strict monogamy, is that equally kind of countercultural as well?
Oh, 100%. That when Paul writes in Ephesians 5 and says that wives are to obey your husbands, that's something that fits very, very snugly into that ancient culture. But when he also says, and husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church,
right?
That is completely and utterly radical. Yeah, that is
in the sense of sacrificial.
In the sense of that sacrificial, that humility, that serving of your wife in that way, and especially the monogamy. It was fine for husbands just to go to the brothel. It was fine for husbands to use their slaves. That was deemed perfectly acceptable. That was deemed quite normal. In fact, almost as a bit of a rite of passage for most people, that it would just not be an issue at all in that kind of ancient world. That it was, and when Paul comes and says about being celibate, it's really hard as well, because it's like I'm just trying to think of like a modern context. I guess in today's world where you kind of are what you achieve and all that kind of stuff, it'd be like saying don't work, don't earn money. You know, people that go and work for the Lord and don't take any salary or anything like that, and that seems quite countercultural to us. It'd be like that but on steroids, because you're talking about your eternity and all that kind of thing. So very, very countercultural. But what's quite interesting when you look at the development of Christianity, so there's a guy called Rodney Stark who's a social historian. He wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, and the first converts predominantly were all women, precisely because of this vision that was being cast. And it's quite interesting when Paul is writing really to wives, saying that if you've converted and your husband is not a Christian, you can be released if your husband wants to release you, but actually your witness to them can see them saved. And what you then see is a life transformation taking place in the lives of these women that acts as a witness to the husband. Brilliant. Which then sees them come through. So you think of people like Augustine's mother, who I'm pretty sure fell into that category there.
We all know Augustine rather well, don't we?
St. Augustine was one of the church fathers who was instrumental in
the 4th century.
4th century, yeah. So he was around during the Council of Hippo in 393 when they formed the canon of the New Testament. He wrote the first autobiography in the Western world called His Confessions, and is kind of seen as this giant theologian.
So his mother would have kind of fit into that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So obviously Jesus is, as always, our prime example. He's the perfect example. Particularly, and you've used this phrase, countercultural, and you've referenced the Apostle Paul as well, who not only do we have examples from his life, we also have his letters to do that. And, you know, I'm sure there'd be conversations we could have around the Roman emperors and obviously when Christianity became a state religion. But those aside, Christianity, but from its very nature, remains countercultural, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that's very much the case for us now as well, isn't it? Because yes, there are perhaps differences, but because it's very nature. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? What, using the examples you've used from the ancient world and the church, where do we find ourselves now with that? What does that look like for us? In the modern culture that we're in.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think. I think when you start to look at our kind of modern day context, what's kind of really difficult and challenging for us is getting our head wrapped around how influential our culture is to us.
Yeah.
And so
it's the sea we swim in, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
the air we breathe, as Glenn Scrivener would say.
Yes, yeah. And so being very aware of the lens that we wear, even as Christians, and having this that lens serving it is the way that we kind of view what is good, almost in many respects.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like you grow up celebrating Christmas in a particular way.
Yes.
And you think it's the only way to celebrate Christmas.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you fall in love with someone and you go and spend Christmas with their family, maybe before you married or after you got married, and they celebrate Christmas differently.
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, I thought there was only one way to celebrate Christmas. And it unsettles you, doesn't it?
Yes.
And
that's what the scriptures are trying to do to you as well, isn't it? It's trying to mess with with your internal kind of system that's going on. So like a classic example, there's a really helpful book for people that would want to check it out called Reading Scripture Through Western Eyes. And it kind of goes through the cultural frameworks that you can do, and some of it's working off the work of George Lakoff and Metaphors We Live By. And just a really good example is in a Western world, we have this idea that time is money. That's a metaphor we live by.
Yeah.
Time becomes a resource. How did you spend your time? Oh, I really lost that time. Having the car accident really cost me some time. All of our language is all around this kind of stuff. But there's no biblical principle for that. In the scriptures, we don't see time being a resource in that kind of sense. And we can have this kind of modern day almost morality around how we spend our time. But in the biblical framework, time was far more cyclical, and the way that we spend time with people, for instance, and the way in our modern, I need my alone time, that time's really precious to me, all of this kind of language. And we see that in a moral, this is what is good.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But in a biblical framework, that's not necessarily the case. Of course, we've got to be good stewards and all that kind of stuff, but that particular way that we view it. And so counterculturally, then we come in and we say, okay, how does Jesus want me to spend my time? And even then I'm falling into the cultural framework that we have on time. And it's more just, what does Jesus want me to do right now? Not even just how do I spend my time? And so there's things like that. And I think your example is really good and really helpful, James, of that new Christmas experience, or even when you meet your partner's family and see that family works in different ways, and it's discombobulating, isn't it?
Or you go to a different country and they speak a different language, they drive on a different side of the road, they eat their dinner at 9 o'clock at night, and all that kind of stuff.
And all that kind of brings like certainly when you go to the other country, it brings like this superficial level of stuff, but then there's much deeper things.
So let's think for a second then about the kind of culture that we would live in day to day, and let's use as an example, it's not the perfect example because we'll have people listening and watching from around the world, but we all live in the United Kingdom, so kind of let's use that as our kind of example. So how would you define some of the kind of key characteristics of kind of contemporary culture today? Let's start, for example, with God. So probably different from the ancient world where people believed in lots of gods.
Yes.
How contemporary culture in the United Kingdom, is it more religious, more spiritual than the world that Jesus and Paul were interacting with, less so? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, we're in secular society. And
what do you mean by secular?
It's removed from any kind of religious kind of connotations.
Okay.
There's no God involved. It's trying to live life without God. That's what it is.
And sometimes people will call that humanism, wouldn't they? Instead?
Yes.
So you kind of secular
humanism would be, I think, slightly different in that humans are at the very center of the world. So
right. Okay.
Not all people that are secular would believe necessarily that humans are the center of the world.
That's helpful. Okay.
But yeah, so I think it's quite interesting when you look throughout history to see the changes that have taken place in society and the changes that have taken place in culture that have led to this removal of God from the world. And what you find, Charles Taylor writes about this in Secular Age, that's the book, isn't it? James Smith, actually, much better than going to Charles Taylor if you're going to look for it. James Smith writes a book, How Not to Be Secular, which is kind of a summative work of that. But he talks about how we live in a world now that is kind of decoupled from the sacred that is there. And so what you end up with is in some respects, it's an ancient heresy. I mentioned it before. It's something called Gnosticism, and the idea is that you have a spiritual self and a physical self, and the spiritual self is something that's more valuable. And what you have in a world that's kind of decoupled in our modern context from an idea of the sacred, from an idea of the religious or God, is that you have a material world, and so you find ideas of materialism and that kind of thing coming through there. And
materialism is effectively the notion that only what you can see, feel and touch is real.
Absolutely. Okay. But what that does is it stands in contrast to our lived experience.
Right.
Because we recognise, I think, that it's, Ecclesiastes talks about God set eternity in our hearts. Amen. That there's something more that's there, and people don't have the language really to talk about that. And so what you find in our kind of modern day context is the idea of being the authentic self. And so what you find now is is this separation between the material and the self, or the spiritual, or the soul, or whatever, rather than a holistic whole, which has led to a place today where the only way that you can be your true self is how you actually feel.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's
the therapeutic.
Yeah,
kind of culture,
okay. Absolutely. Therapeutic gospel. Mm. And so that then starts to feed through into all of the narratives. So you look at every kind of Disney film, basically, and you find your true self through.
It all comes from one line in Shakespeare. It all comes from one line in Shakespeare, where in Hamlet, where Polonius says to Ophelia, I think it's Polonius says it to Ophelia, "To thine own self be true." Mm. Yeah, it's all of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So do you find in your experience in kind of engaging with people, but let's particularly use the age group you're working with now, are you finding that a belief in God, or belief in the supernatural, a belief in something spiritual, is that present in people?
I think what I'm finding more with that kind of Gen Z demographic is that more people are open to the idea.
Okay.
And so
open with a kind of a hostility, a cynicism, or kind of an interest? I
think that you still find the cynics that are there, but there are people that are open to that kind of thing.
Right. There were cynics on the day of Pentecost, weren't there? So
of course,
cynics,
and so I think in the conversations, if you can start to put and if you start to put language to people's felt experience, and say, I think this is actually speaking of the things and purposes that God has desired for you in your life, people start to kind of click and resonate, because something that they've not yet been able to articulate has got language that's being put to it.
Okay.
And so I find in those conversations, whether it's on, I have quite a lot of conversations with people about sexuality, for instance.
Which is a very hot topic in our culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Where the kind of moral framework around that is that you can only find true fulfillment in sexual union with another. That's the kind of the narrative story that comes from that. And so therefore, if I am only attracted to somebody of the same sex, then I can only ever be truly happy if I find sexual union with that person. Mm-hmm. Therefore, anything that the scriptures say must be wrong on this, and either to the point of it being untrue or it's just been distorted.
Right.
And you've got different ways in which people kind of deal with that depending on their own kind of belief. And so what we then have to do is start looking at how we reframe the narrative, basically, and go, what you're saying to me is that you believe that this is the ultimate good. Is that right? And they go, I've never really quite thought about it like that before. And you go, well, that's the story that you're telling me. Because if you're saying that I must do this, then that becomes the ultimate good. And you're back into the Garden of Eden, aren't you?
Okay.
Defining what is good. And so we go, okay, well, if we look at the scriptures, we've got to define what the scriptures say. We've got to look and search the scriptures to see what is good according to the scriptures. And so what we are then able to do is start to flip the narrative and help people to understand that they're part of a gospel story. And in doing that, it becomes a much better place to start from, because we're not starting on you can't have this thing that you really want. It's that actually the thing that you really want is a distorted truth. There's a good in finding sexual union with another, but it's not the ultimate truth. It's not the ultimate end. Your true fulfillment is found in Jesus.
Yeah.
And anything short of that leads to an unfulfilled life. So let's talk around that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So one of the ways that I find certainly talking about the sexuality stuff really helpful with people, because a lot of people haven't thought so much about it in those kind of ways. And so one of the ways that I'll start a conversation off with somebody is going, like, let's go on a journey together. If you're interested in finding out what Jesus thinks, then let's go through some of the scriptures, and I'll do my best to help you to understand that. But I want you to know, though you know that I'm coming from a particular position, this is because I really believe this is what the scriptures point us to. But I want you to know that if you can demonstrate to me from the scriptures that what I believe is wrong, I will change my mind, because of that's how highly I value the authority of the scriptures.
Okay.
And so I'm making that the kind of foundation point there with people. And it kind of almost de-escalates the potential of the conversation, because it gives them a place to go, okay, I'm going to search, and then you can let the word speak for itself when you go through that.
And since you've kind of started to talk a little bit about how you practically engage with people on some of these issues, you've got some kind of top tips for us about how we can engage with culture. So do you want to talk us through those?
Yeah. So just super practically, and I'm quite conscious in this conversation, I've been throwing out some of the books and stuff.
It's okay, Kier's read all of them.
I really don't want people to feel intimidated in saying that the only way that I can engage with culture is if I've done all of this reading and I can understand. I think that anyone can engage with culture. What you've got to do is know what you believe. Peter says always be prepared for an answer, but that doesn't mean that's knowing all of the apologetics and all that kind of stuff. You just need to know your story. And the scriptures, as we've kind of alluded to before, they cause us to need to think deeply about the big questions of life. And so my encouragement to you is to just make sure you've thought deeply about them from the point of your experience and from what you've shared in the scriptures. And so when you come and you talk to somebody about how do you find true fulfillment in life, how do you deal with suffering, all of this kind of stuff, that you've actually spent time thinking deeply about it from your own perspective. You don't need to go and read all of these books. And what you do is you bring the truth that you've experienced, the truth of Jesus, and you bring it into that, and you are engaging in culture in that way. I think the importance of doing your research and reading around comes where you want to critique culture. And that's very different to engaging with culture. And there is an absolute place where we need to critique culture, because we need to expose some of the faults with the way of thinking and help people understand where it all comes from, etc., etc. But that's not everybody's calling. But everybody is called to engage. Absolutely.
So that's the first bit, is to kind of know your own story. And
know your own story.
What's your next tip?
So I would say questions are your friend.
Yeah, I like that. Questions are your friend.
Questions are your friend. And I think with me, whenever I'm talking with somebody who doesn't know Jesus, or maybe they're just starting on the journey, or maybe it's quite evident that even though they say they're a Christian, that they don't know Jesus, is that I'll just ask them questions. I just want to hear their life, really. And very often in those conversations, I spend most of the time not talking. And that really is probably your most effective way of engaging with culture or engaging with the person, is just asking them.
Right.
And don't be afraid. I find some of the most helpful questions being, oh, why do you believe that?
Yeah.
It's not an offensive question at all. It's just helping them to go deeper. Often they're like, oh, nobody's ever asked me that before. It's like, well, it's quite an important thing to think about.
Yeah.
I remember I had a conversation with with a family member, and they came to me and just said, Harry, I just don't understand how you can believe all of this stuff. It's like, do you want me to explain? She's like, yeah, explain. So I started talking about my own kind of personal experience, my subjective experience. I talked about the objective reality and truth that's there. I talked about, how believing in Christianity gives me answers for creation, for purpose, for morality, for destiny, and she gave me permission to talk about it. And she was like, oh, wow. I was like, you need to understand, I have reasons to believe. It's not a blind leap of faith.
Yeah.
There's all of this stuff which has actually led me to believe. There's good foundations for me believing. This isn't something that I've just kind of grown up with.
Yeah.
And then I said, what do you believe? It was quite interesting because she just jumped to life after death. That was it. Her whole framework for what she believed was just what happened after she died. And it was essentially this, which I think is quite common out there, is, well, I think that if you're good, live a good life, whatever that is.
Yeah.
If you live a good life, then I get to, when I die, I go to some kind of heaven, which in their mind is kind of living on clouds or something. And I can see my aunt and my dog and be with my family for eternity, and everything is happy. And I just said, why do you believe that? I said, I've just given you all of my reasons. Why do you believe that? What gives you reason to believe that? She said, I don't really know. I just think it's the right thing. And I said, you've got more faith than I do to believe that without any reasons that you've got. And so just asking that question exposed a fault line in the way that they're thinking.
I think a lot of people's idea of the afterlife at the moment is basically The Good Place off Netflix.
yeah, absolutely.
And that's quite common, isn't it?
Yeah.
Basically, life after death is an extension of this life.
Yeah.
Equality going on forever and ever. That's really helpful. So questions are your friend. What's the next tip you've got for us?
And it kind of links into the questions thing, is that I remember reading Francis Schaeffer. If you've not read Francis Schaeffer, it's very good to read. Escape from Reason, quite a short book, which kind of, there's an archaeology of thought of modern times as to why the culture is like it is. But one of the things he says in a book called The God Who's There is that when you are in discussion with people, what you are doing is you're tearing down their house. You're tearing down their worldview, and you're making them really, really vulnerable. And I know for me, one of the things that I wanted to do is, when I had exposed them, I wanted to go in for the kill. And that is not helpful at all, because even though you are right, you are hardening people to the gospel. And I had to do some of my own soul searching, where I just wanted to be right. I wanted to prove myself to be more intelligent than the other person, and to demonstrate that Christianity is robust and all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't need me to be able to do that. But when you are asking these questions, and when you are exposing people for what they actually believe and why they believe it, and the holes that are all there, etc., is that's when love is needed.
Okay.
I think it's quite telling with Jesus when he's in dialogue with people, when he's speaking with people from different cultures, like the Samaritan lady, that just the compassion that's there, and the love that's there speaks really, really loudly. I think I find it really fascinating that when you look at the letters of Paul, it's in the broad scheme of things, there's not actually much stuff on kind of charismatic gifts and moving in miracle, sign and wonder and all that kind of thing. The major thing that he's concerned with is just loving people and loving people well.
Yeah.
And that in doing that, that is a much greater witness and speaks to a greater miracle where there is a unity of spirit that's there. And so I would just say that that in those conversations, do everything that you can to love people. Don't be ashamed of the truth. Don't be afraid to share the truth. Don't be afraid to ask questions to expose, but always come and do the loving thing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
How many more have you got for us?
The only other one I would say is it kind of links into maybe coming into critique, but don't be afraid to listen to other perspectives. So when I was doing my research on sexuality and gender, that was sparked really because there was somebody that we led to the Lord, and she'd been like fantastic in the church and then came out as gay, and I didn't really know how to pastor her at all. And I knew what the scripture said, but I didn't really know kind of a deeper understanding of that. But what really helped me come to a much deeper appreciation of not just her perspective, but of the world. And it kind of ended badly with this particular person. But reading other people's stories from their perspectives, not from a Christian foundation. So reading autobiographies of people's experience of going through the transgender process, people's lives of what it was like to be in the HIV kind of crisis in the 90s and all that kind of thing. It helped to broaden my understanding, broaden my compassion, and broaden my empathy. It wasn't just coming from a critical point of view, but helped me to really see the individual and to see the person. So
kind of seeking to know and understand.
Yeah. So I would say those are kind of just really super practical. Really practical stuff.
And I think it chimes in a lot with lessons we've learnt in previous episodes and previous series, actually, when we've talked to people like Arne Skargen, who will talk about learning to hear harvest language, learning to recognise that the harvest is ripe. And I think, as we begin to engage with a culture around us, because that effectively means engaging with people, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
We find that there are lost sheep that Jesus is seeking through us. There are people who are blind that God wants to shine his light on. And it's a great opportunity for us to act, like you've said, in love, in redemptively, without judgment. And I think you're right. None of us should be afraid of the culture that we're part of. A great man called Charles Simpson once said, "You're not ready to go into any area of society until you know that Jesus is Lord of it." And I think that's a really good way for us to think about what you said. Harry, great to be with you. Thanks for your sharing with us. Thanks for the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And thanks for reading all those books for us.
Absolutely.
Until next time on the All Nations Church podcast, thanks for listening. Thanks for being with us. Kier, as ever, nice to be with you.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you again soon.
See you soon.
God bless.
Thank you.